Hello and welcome to Side Ventures. My name is Gino, and each episode I'll be talking to someone about things they do outside of their day job that brings joy and sometimes a bit of income into their lives. In this episode, I'm joined by Jordan and Melissa, a husband and wife couple who have your typical day jobs, but in the evenings and weekends, they're the co-founders of a medieval sword fighting academy. Listen in as we discuss how they're rediscovering forgotten ancient fighting techniques, and why they chose a wolf as an icon for their academy, what they spend all their earnings on, and why Jordan has a particular chip on his shoulder about certain prizes that have been won at tournaments. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Jordan and Melissa from the Academy of Steel. Welcome both of you. Jordan, if you could introduce yourself, tell us where you're from and a little bit about your day job, please.
Yeah, sure. I work at Escape Reality, which is an escape room place in Cardiff. It's part of a chain. There are a few throughout the country. Ours is obviously the best. Yeah, I come from the valleys. I lived abroad for a bit, so moved around a little while. Lived in Kazakhstan for a bit, lived in Italy for a little bit, which is kind of where I got into what we're going to talk about later. And then came back to Britain. Melissa and I got married and sort of settled down here.
I'm Melissa. My day job is I'm a paraplan and administrator for a financial advisor. Yes, that's Jordan making snoring noises because it's boring. It's boring, and apparently a snooze-inducing job description. But you know, it pays the bills and it keeps my brain occupied. Jordan and I spent about 4 years in Italy, and we've spent the last 5 years in Cardiff with our school.
So let's talk about the school then. So obviously you've mentioned the day jobs, but we're here to talk about side hustles and side ventures. And the two of you, a husband and wife couple, run the Academy of Steel. So what is the Academy of Steel?
So it's a historical European martial arts school, and historical European martial arts it's the revival and reinvention of martial arts that existed in Europe in the medieval period. It could be earlier in some cases. The Renaissance period, and then kind of into the sort of like early modern period. There are certain people that kind of try and revive World War I and World War II era martial arts, but we focus primarily on the medieval because that's kind of our passion. So for the most part, our study is of a guy called Fiore de' Liberi, who was an Italian knight and master of arms. He basically left us these 4 manuscripts, which are to do with wrestling, grappling with a dagger, longsword, which is kind of like my love. It's to do with like fighting in armor, out of armor, on horseback, all of these things that a soldier in the medieval period, like a professional soldier, needed to know. But kind of died out around the invention of gunpowder. Yeah, gunpowder and firearms. Kind of died out around then. And whereas there's like this living lineage in the East, in the West, it's sort of like it morphed into what we think of as like modern Olympic fencing. So a lot of the time when you talk about fencing, that's the thing that pops into your head is like 2 people dressed in white, kind of like going at each other with very springy foils. And they're both, they're fantastic sports. It's just that's not what I was interested in. And when I found out that there was this kind of like movement to recreate this sort of stuff, then yeah, I couldn't not do it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
throughout history, swords were the weapon of warfare, and as technology evolved, the sword evolved and changed into different shapes, which most people don't really recognize. But you will think, oh, okay, so you've got these really big 2-handed swords, long swords. A lot of people call them claymores, even though that's a very specific sword. But these big swords of knightly combat, and then evolving into these finer swords that you might see in a Princess Bride and side swords and things like that. So it evolves through centuries of sword evolution, and there's fighting styles that are specific to those swords, but they've all been lost because when gunpowder and firearms came in, and the swords went out of fashion, there were only 3 types of swords that were still kind of being used, and those turned into the foil, épée, and saber that you have in modern Olympic fencing, which kind of that was the sport that then got trained. But all the swords and sword styles from before that have gotten forgotten by history, except you had masters and who recorded manuals, which were then kept in these rich people's archives and noblemen's collections for centuries, which due to the digital age have now become available for, you know, your common person to have access to look at, to research. A lot of them have photos. Some of them are in languages that are a little bit archaic, but you can translate them. So, well, photos, I mean images, like
Yes.
illustrations. Some of them are just text. So you've got people now who are researching what it says, translating it into words, but then there's the other element of trying to figure out what they're saying into actual movement and action. So it is a dead martial art that we're trying to revive by reading the sources and then trying to figure out, okay, does he mean move it this way? So move the sword to the other side. Okay, but what angle, how, and all these things which you need to try and work out in practice to figure out how it works. And once you figure it out, then you can pass it on and teach it. So Jordan's very good at interpreting the manuals and trying and be like, okay, I think this means that. And then that's what we teach to our students. So it's historical European martial art is the umbrella, but it's also historical fencing is another way of saying it.
So historical European martial arts, that makes a lot of sense. So it's not like what you'd consider sort of other parts of the world where you might have something like karate or judo. This is specifically to Europe, medieval warfare, that sort of thing. And you're talking about these books, these manuscripts and these instructions. So these are things you can actually take instruction from. They're pretty clear. It's clear enough at least to do some interpretation. So you're not just making this up now. These are based on historical techniques. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's always going to be a need to insulate certain things where there are gaps, because whenever anybody writes this or writes these manuals, there's kind of like an assumed knowledge on the part of the reader. So a lot of the time they'll just exclude things like footwork, because it's like, well, if you're a knight and you've been born into like the role of a knight, then you'll know that, all this stuff anyway. So there's almost like no need. And so you kind of have to reverse engineer it and go, okay, well, you're standing here, you're looking at body mechanics. So one of the things that I'm really interested in is like learning how the body moves. It is a combination of like what we know, like what we knew from back then, what we know now, how we can kind of put that together and then turn our students into people who are quite formidable.
So you talked about your students, and this is an academy. This is what you do. This is the business side of things, right? So you've chosen to take what you do and instruct others. Why have you chosen to do that? You've mentioned tournaments before, so I've seen your videos on your social media, which everyone should check out. The social media channels you've got are incredible. And obviously I can see that there are tournaments that you guys go to. So you could just choose to train yourselves, learn from the books, and go to tournaments, compete yourselves. Why is it you choose to teach others?
I wanted to teach this because I wanted there to be a place where people like me could be, right? So I grew up doing loads of different martial arts. I boxed when I was a kid. I did sports fencing as well because it was kind of like the closest thing I could get to what I want to do now.
And you've always wanted to do this sort of thing?
Yeah, I was that kid that picked up a stick and like used it like a sword, but I didn't grow out of that. Do you know what I mean? Like, a lot of people did, they moved on, they picked up, they got girlfriends and did like cool stuff and they went out, and I'm still there with a stick, so I'm like, yeah, this is cool. So, cause, and I went to these different martial arts schools and they were like 2 or 3 ways of where it would go. There was like, there were people who were like, oh no, I'm the master, you can't question me. Right. And all this sort of stuff. And, they wouldn't even look me in the eye when I was paying them and all this sort of stuff. And I was the nerd, you know what I mean? Like I was like, because I was scrappy when I was a kid, but I was always like really socially awkward as well and this kind of thing. Because I was into like Star Wars, and everybody else where I grew up in the valleys was into rugby or football, and I didn't give a shit about that. So, I'd go to these places where it's like, okay, but I'm still the outsider. And then, I'd go to other places where the head honcho was just kind of a bit of a bully, right? Or even if they had the best of intentions, they're using things like negative reinforcement. They're like, I'm going to get the best out of you. I'm going to get the best out of you. I'm going to hit you. I'm going to make you train under these like grueling conditions and stuff like that. And I responded okay to that. But at the same time, I was still an outsider because it's like, people think when they watch these films, like, like when they have like the really stoic or kind of like standoffish master who's like, you got to earn their respect and all this sort of stuff. Like, the thing about my students is like, I wanted a place where when they came in, I knew that what I wanted was community, the kind of community I never got, that I never had access to. And it's not about like, oh, I'm going to get the best out of you. I'm like, I want you to get the best out of yourself, kind of thing, right? So you've got these, like, my guys, I love my guys. I have the best students in the world, right? And I'll fight anybody who argues with me on that one, right? And I'll win. But, they're the best students in the world. And, because they've come in and they've given so much of themselves to each other. And it's not about like, oh yeah, I'm going to see how much you can endure. It's about like, I'm going to make you pull off this technique, something that you never thought you could do, right? And once you do that, you realize, like, for some people, it's the first time, I think, for some of them, that they've realized I am worthy, right? Like, and that seems like a really pompous thing, right? But I've got students who suffer from like PTSD, some who suffer from like other health conditions or social anxiety and stuff like that. And they've done things that they never thought they were capable of because they've gone to these other dojos or these other training things and they've been the new person and they haven't quite fit in. People fit in with us because they give us something of themselves and we give them everything in return. And that's what I wanted. Right. I don't care if you're the best fencer in the world. I care that you are the best fencer that you can be, because that's the passion. That's what I wanted to give them.
There aren't that many spaces where nerds, and we are nerds, where nerds,
I'm not a nerd.
where nerds can go and be themselves, but also do something that's healthy and it engages the brain and it engages the body because it is physically active, but in a way that you can pace yourself.
I've got so many questions now based on what you just said about your students, tournaments, competitions, the reason why people do it. But I want to get a bit more specific into actually the sport itself, right? So you talked about the fact that you are using techniques that come from these manuscripts and these books. You are competing with each other. There's a competitive element. You're sparring with each other. So I'm assuming that these swords are, plastic, made of foam? Like, how do you do this safely?
So we don't use sharp swords. When you first come to us, we will you'll start training with a synthetic sword, which is basically a plastic, which has some flex, as in it bends a little bit. Because one of the very common techniques that you have within a manuscript is pushing a thrust. And if you push a thrust with something that's completely rigid, it will break bones because there's nothing there to stop it. So all the weapons that we use have some flex in them so that it will flex before it goes straight through the body, which is why we don't tend to use wooden swords or shinai like they do in kendo, because they have no flex in them. So you'll start with a synthetic sword and then you'll move on to steel, and we do encourage you to train with steel. And these steels they have a rebated edge, so they're a couple of millimeters thick at the edge. The tip is either rolled or spatulated, or basically like a size of a thumb rather than a sharp point, so that it doesn't actually puncture through anything. So the weapons, we are using steel swords and we're using them as you would a steel sword, but we also wear a fencing mask and padded equipment, maybe with plastic armor in various places and chest protector. So it almost looks like we're wearing a bomb disposal suit sometimes, certain levels of protection and padding, but so that we can do the techniques with a decent amount of force, so that they can actually work without necessarily going at each other and causing injury. Because we are flinging around rods of metal, which will hurt if you don't use them with control. So part of what we teach is also how to do it technically, correctly, martially, but also with control, where you're not going to hurt your sparring partner, but also you could if you were actually in a duel.
So that's really interesting. So you're actually using metal swords, and you said there are certain techniques that you teach to make sure that people are, say, pulling their punches right and not going too far. Are there any specific things that just cannot be done? Any instructions that come from these manuscripts that you can't make safe in any way, that you can't even begin to teach because there's no way of making it safe that if the person misses the block, they're going to get tapped and be fine?
Like I've got a couple of swords that they're too heavy for me to use in sparring because the moment I make contact with somebody, they crumple like cardboard, you know. So I'm like, I just can't use this safely. Because they're heavy swords. They're the kind of swords that you'd like, you know, you'd wade into a battlefield. You're like, okay, you know, I'll take the head off this horse and then like, there's a guy in armor, no problem. What's that? No armor? Ooh, bad choice. You know, so yeah.
So there's obviously techniques like that with certain weapons. There's just no way to use them safely. Some people try, but we don't think that there's a safe way of doing it. But then there are obvious techniques like kick their knee out and break their knee, or kick him in the groin, which, you know, people tend to think is rude. So we don't...
generally frowned upon.
Yeah, generally frowned upon in martial arts in general. So we don't do those techniques. We'll say that this is something that the manuscript says at this point you would do this, but we won't actually encourage that in sparring. So in sparring, we'll do the techniques that can be done safely with the equipment that we use. And that's the kind of stuff that we'll do in sparring and tournaments. There is a tournament aspect to HEMA, and tournaments tend to have a lot more restrictions on techniques that you can do, because we will encourage grappling and doing the techniques which go into the grapple and then maybe takedowns to the ground. Those are techniques we will do, but those are restricted and they don't do them in tournaments. So tournaments tend to be more just straight up cut, thrust, that kind of stuff. Depending on the school and who's running the school, there are different levels of where the line is of what we will do and what we won't do. There's some people out in, where are they? I don't know, Russia, Germany, who literally spar full on with sharp swords, and we think that is absolutely bonkers.
Yeah, that's absolutely fair. And I mean, I think I've got a good idea now of what it would look like to be in your academy, right? So you've got your techniques. I imagine it's something similar to what you see in, say, films and movies and TV shows, right? In terms of like sword fighting and medieval kind of combat. You're using metal swords. You're fully padded in armor. I encourage everyone to take a look at your social media channels. You're on Instagram, you're on TikTok, because there's plenty of videos on there. What I'm curious now is about the academy itself. So you've already talked about your students. How many classes do you have? How many people roughly in a class? Who are the kind of people that come into your classes? I'm assuming it's quite a male-dominated sport, but, you know, what's the makeup of your typical group?
So as far as the classes go, we run Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Sunday. So it's becoming less of a side hustle. We get like anywhere between a dozen to kind of like 24 students per class. Like sometimes it's really hectic. Sometimes it's quiet is about 10 to 12, isn't it? Mm-hmm. We have beginners courses, that sort of thing. Unfortunately, as far as it being male dominated, we are doing our level best to try to change that, because the thing is, if you put an advert up on Facebook, on Instagram, whatever, and you're like, hey, I'll learn to use the sword, and you just put a sword there, right? Guys will just show up, right? For women, for people who identify as women, non-binary folks, like, you really got to encourage them and say, hey, yeah, this is for you as well. And that can be a struggle. Like this is one of the things that Melissa has worked very hard on.
Yeah, so we have 3 chapters. We have a chapter in Cardiff Central, we have one in Caerphilly, and we have one out towards Newport. And the Cardiff one, I ran a special event and then a beginner course that was just for women. And what's really nice is that now not just the people that came from that course, but anyone who's joined afterwards, because there's quite a lot of women in the classes in general, it's seen as a much safer space for people to come to. So sometimes we have parity, so it'll be more or less even. On a few occasions, we've had more women than men, which always makes me happy. The other chapters are less diverse. They are very male dominated. I'm usually only myself and maybe one other. But it's something that we're trying to encourage, because it really doesn't make that much of a difference. You've got a sword. So your opponent is at the other end of a sword. And yes, they might be stronger than you, but a lot of the techniques are specifically aimed at your opponent is stronger than you and they are trying to dominate you. What do you do? And then it's kind of like the whole, jiu-jitsu or judo, where you literally use their strength against them, use the force that they're putting on your sword against them. And defeat them. So there's loads of techniques there to overcome someone who's stronger and taller than you. And that's one of the great things about swords. They equalize the strength disparity.
Yeah, it sounds like the techniques and the swords then are a great equalizer.
Melissa just said use the Force, which backs up my argument that she's a nerd and I'm not.
I didn't
right?
make it as a reference, though.
Yeah, but you said it like, use the Force. Anyway.
I mean, have you had people turn up asking to be taught how to use lightsabers?
Look,
Does that happen?
I have. I've had people ask me about really weird weapons, you know what I mean? Like, I've had somebody be like, oh, can you teach me how to use a bat'leth, which is like this...
From Star Trek.
Yeah, do you know what I mean? Yeah. I'm like, no, because it's a crap weapon. Do you know what I mean? It's like...
Oh, I'm going to get all the Trekkies now emailing in.
I'm sorry, okay? I'm sorry, but it's like... you can email me, like some people do, like sometimes I'll make a statement about like, this is a crap weapon, right? And I get people on Instagram going like, you said it's a crap weapon. Like, they get really angry and I'm like, yeah, cool. TLDR. Sorry. But what Melissa was saying about kind of like the sword being an equalizer is absolutely true. You can go to these like, you can go to Muay Thai and have massive respect for like the people who go to Muay Thai and Judo and Jiu-Jitsu, and like just general boxing and stuff, and like how much conditioning that they do and all this sort of stuff. But no matter how hard you work, you cannot condition yourself against the edge of a sword, right? Yeah. There's a guy who tried, right? There's this years-old video of this guy who thought he could harden his skin through breathing exercises, right? There's a video on YouTube, you can look it up, and he takes a machete and he hacks into his arm and he looks so surprised when he's just bleeding everywhere. Oh, wow. Yeah, it's like, yeah, don't do that. So...
Okay, well, we talked about the people in your academy, and you've mentioned you've got 3 chapters. How long have you been running? When did you start doing this?
About a year before COVID, we opened up. And
so not that long.
No, we just celebrated our 5-year anniversary. Obviously, we had COVID in that time. One of the main challenges was keeping our students together, keeping them sane, and like keeping that community together. We actually have 4 chapters if you count, because we've got 2 in Cardiff. So we've got Cardiff Central, we've got Cardiff East, and then the Newport one and the
Yeah. I was just thinking about 3 cities, but yeah, you're right. We do have 4. One thing that we're quite proud of is that during COVID we didn't stop. So we had to stop the classes in person, right, but we went online. So we had 1 class a week online on Zoom, and 1 sort of like fitness training. We were just doing circuits together as almost like a fitness club. And then 1 night a week, we also just watched movies together on Zoom. So we kept the community spirit together, and people were still being connected through the academy and has some kind of like social interactions, because for some people it is their only social circle. Not like most people have other social circles and it's just a aspect of the hobby, but for some people they're quite insular and it is their only social circle. So we wanted to make sure that they still had access to that even though they couldn't come to classes. So yeah, we kept that going. And then as soon as they let us meet in groups of 15, we opened up the classes for groups of 15. Even before they let us go into indoors, we opened up once it was permissible to meet in outdoor spaces. We're meeting in outdoor spaces, doing classes outside, and then moved inside as it opened up. So we only really lost about half a year of in-person classes during COVID because we only stopped them when we weren't allowed to. It felt like an eternity, but it wasn't that big a chunk out of our class time. So we didn't shut down, which is something we're quite proud of.
Since we've come out of COVID, we've hit the ground running, because I think a lot of people became aware of HEMA and what we do during COVID. They were looking into it, and then we were able. We've been expanding ever since, which is nice. That's really cool.
We've talked about your social media before, and on your social media accounts, obviously, I've had a look. I can see there's lots of tournaments you go to, there's lots of competitions. How much of a factor is that in the training that you're doing, training for competitions? And, for the competitions that you go to, you obviously go as a group, you go as a collective, but you also compete as individuals. Like, what do you win? Are there medals, trophies? Is there cash prizes? What sort of things people can win in these competitions?
Well, I'm going to let Melissa take this one. No, okay. I'm gonna let Melissa take this one because, like, do you know what? I'll do it. I'll do the bragging for you because that's more impressive, isn't it? It's when somebody else does all the bragging for you, right? So yeah, basically, I don't train specifically for tournaments because I don't. I find that can be quite a narrow path, right? One of the things that, like, I tell my students is that, you can train 3 things for tournaments and you can win them, right? So, like, train 3 techniques really, really well. Just do that, right? And you can win them. And there are ways of, like, gaming the system that I find can sometimes detract a little bit from, like, what we're trying to do. I enjoy tournaments, but they're not they're not the end result. And I think that's one of the things that I try and kind of distill in the way that I teach is that, the person who's trying to get to a destination is never going to get as far as the person who just enjoys going for a walk. Like if you love the process, then that's the thing that will feed your love for continuation and, and there's longevity in that. When we take part in tournaments, we generally, Melissa and I will go. I'm finding it harder and harder to take part in tournaments because I refuse to fight against my students, right? So if my students sign up to a tournament, I will, like, step out. I'll step back from it. But yeah, they go along. They have a great time. Melissa is killing it at the moment. So earlier this year, she took the first place in the Albion Cup Women's Longsword, which is like an international tournament of, like, some renown.
Wow.
Yeah. She won a sword with a sword that she had won, right? So you can win.
She won a sword as a prize in a previous tournament.
Yeah.
And using that sword.
Won another sword.
So you've got 2 swords now that you've won as tournament prizes.
Yeah, 2 swords. Do you know how many swords I've won?
How many, Jordan?
None.
Yeah. Which everyone is always so fucking quick to remind me.
I can see that this is perhaps a sore point.
It is a tad.
Sword point.
It's a tad. Yeah.
Okay, right, I'll tell you this, right? My students make fun of me for it, right? And I'm like, yeah, cool, great, yeah, excellent. Anyway, I was walking through town the other day. I bump into Melissa's parents, right? And the first thing, her mum turns to me and just goes, "Oh, Melissa's doing really well, has won a lot of medals and trophies. Where are yours?" And I was like, "Yeah, cool. Anyway, so lovely to run into you. Like these conversations are a balm for the soul."
I just hope they don't hear this now.
I hope they do.
Just a bit of a sore point. I enjoy tournaments, and for me, I do agree with everything that Jordan said with regard to tournaments. They do. Some people who are in it just for the medals, they might narrow what they train just so that they can, like, score those points. And we've always said is that if you fight martially, you should be able to win, whether it's in a tournament setting or not. So that's kind of the approach that we tend to take with our training and with our teaching as well, to try and teach martial techniques that happen to also work if you want to go down tournament route. Adrenaline is a drug, and I really like that drug. I like feeling the adrenaline as I'm fencing, and I can't trick my brain into it if there's not something on the line. So I can't trick myself into getting that rush when I'm just sparring. So I really enjoy tournaments because I enjoy the rush that I get. And I feel like my fencing improves when I'm under that pressure, because it's like I see the pattern. Everything goes in slow motion. It's like, oh, this is where to do that technique that I've studied. I don't see it in sparring. I don't get that stimulus, and I can't trick my brain into it. So I really enjoy the way I fence when I'm in a tournament. So that's why I do it. And yeah, I've had a good year. And yes, I really did enjoy winning a sword with a sword that I'd previously won. That was, usually the prizes will be medals, probably chocolates. And if you win the gold in something, it'll be a gift from one of the sponsors, which will either be vouchers for something to buy of your choice, or there might be a sword as a prize if you win that thing. So yeah, it's quite an honor to be able to say that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's and it's incredibly rewarding to watch, like when you're the person who's taught that person, and because we do train it as a martial art, which includes like certain grappling techniques. One of my all-time like highlights for me this year, like there are two highlights. One was watching one of my students, Reese, practically dragging one of the other competitors out of the arena by his scalp. And just like, and I'm having to shout from the sidelines, ring outs aren't worth anything. He's like, I don't care. Right. Which was great, and it's like, that sort of thing. But there was another one, which was one of my other guys, Simon, who's a savage, right? So he's like, ex-army, like, very cool guy, but a nerd, right? He doesn't belong to the army. He belongs to us, right? That's the thing. He's into like, he does like the 3D printing of stuff, like, like the models you can get and the stuff. And I met him, I'm like, you're ex-army? And he's like, you look at him and he's built like a brick shit house. He's got this big beard, and he's got this really intense life. He's lovely, right? But savage, right? And one of the things was like he was doing a workshop on like MMA fighting in like a HEMA context at one of the largest HEMA events in Britain, and he partnered up with somebody, and the guy kind of like leans forward, like just sort of surreptitiously takes a glance at the logo on his t-shirt, and then like leans back to confirm that is the logo that he's seen, and he went, shit. Because you're one of those wolf people, right? And he was like, this isn't going to go well for me. And then Simon telling this story went, and it didn't. Right? It's like, I was all over him, man. Like, I thrashed him, which was great, So to have that reputation as like people who like, if you get close to us, we're gonna maul you. That's ace.
To explain, so the wolf is the icon of your group, right?
Yes,
So I've seen you're wearing a t-shirt with a wolf on it now, Melissa, and Jordan, you're wearing a wolf emblem around your neck there.
Yeah.
So tell us more about the logo, why you've chosen the wolf. I noticed as well a tattoo.
Yes.
With the same logo on it.
Yes,
so
indeed.
Tell us more about that then.
So the this goes back to when I was about 20. I started historical reenactment. So I was doing kind of like early medieval periods, so like Viking Age, what some people call Dark Age reenactment. And I ended up making, with my best friend Ollie, this splinter group. And our whole motif was like wolves. So we just had wolves on our shields, just because I've always liked wolves. Gradually, we just started making this like little group of kind of very good friends, of which Melissa was one. So she joined us. The wolf thing kind of like then it sort of stayed with us, And by the time I wanted to set up my own school, so one of the things was I wanted to take that wolf that had like a lot of meaning for us and make it into what was eventually kind of affectionately by the students been dubbed the Steel Wolf, right? Because it's the Academy of Steel, so it's the Steel Wolf. As a logo, it definitely has it's different, it looks very different. A lot of the students now have like, okay, this is where we get into kind of like, we're definitely not a cult. We're not a cult territory, but a lot of us have like wolf tattoos. A lot of like people have the wolf motif because it's something that it's something that belongs to them, but something that they belong to in turn. So yeah, it's also, I made sure of this. It looks good small. If I could give anybody any advice, right, on making a logo, because I went to college and I studied like graphic design and all this sort of shit. And this is the one thing that I did that's like worth a damn, right, is this logo. But if you make it small, make sure that you can still recognize it. So the wolf, you can literally, like, I've got a wolf pin.
You've got a signet ring.
Yeah, I've got a signet ring with the design on it. I've got like the wolf pin on my jacket, which is like, you can see it's like an inch. If you can recognize it and it's just an inch like wide, an inch high, whatever, great. I see a lot of schools, I see a lot of martial arts schools, I see a lot of people who make these logos and they look great when you look at them on a screen. But if you look at them on a banner, like a drooping banner, or if you look at them like really small, they don't look like anything. They look like a blob. So yeah, that would be my one bit of advice if you're making a logo.
Back to the wolf thing, there's also the whole concept of a pack and a community, and that you are part of a pack. And yes, there's people who are all like, oh, but there's the alpha male, but there's also the alpha female. So you have like a partnership, and that's something that I kind of like associate with it, is because we're a partnership and we run it together, and together we run the Academy of Steel, and we all fight for each other. We all represent each other, and it's a community thing, so that it kind of all fits in very well with the whole wolf theme. Back to tournaments, my sort of there's one photo that you pin on your Facebook, which is like your banner photo on Facebook.
Banner, yeah.
It's a photo that someone took when I was participating in a tournament that happened to be in Cardiff that a lot of our students were taking part in. But I was competing, and I was competing in the finals, and someone took the photo, and I'm standing in my corner. Jordan's standing beside me. I'm just waiting for them to call to fight. And you've got the entirety of all of, like, by maybe 15, 20 students just sort of like fanned round next to that corner, just like supporting me. And so that's my banner photo. But I was actually speaking to my opponent recently. This is because that was taken about a year and a half ago. I was speaking to her recently, and she said, yes, that was so intimidating, just standing there opposite you, seeing you there with your entire school behind you. It was incredibly intimidating. So that was quite nice.
Did you win a sword?
No.
No, you didn't win a sword. I don't always win a sword then, do you?
Nope, not always.
We've talked a lot now about the sports, the training, your academy, your students, but this podcast is about side hustles and side ventures. Let's talk a bit more about the business side of things. So, Melissa, obviously you've got a day job which is all to do with accounting and finance. So I imagine you've got a good handle on this.
Sorry.
But when it comes to the lessons, I'm assuming you charge the students per lesson. You've got costs involved in terms of, I'm guessing, equipment, hall hire. What does that look like? How does the business side of things look for you guys?
Okay. I'm going to hand you over to Melissa, because I do the lesson planning side of things, right? Melissa and Ben do the boring nerd stuff, right? So I'm gonna hand you over. And I'm gonna zone out for like the next 20 minutes.
Yeah, he jokes. He jokes, but he also does most of the social media stuff as well. But yeah, so we charge per month subscription rather than per class, because that's just too difficult to track who's come to what class and who's paid for what class. So you pay a monthly membership, and obviously insurance. But the money that we get in, it goes towards paying for the hall and for any kind of like expenses that we have. But also it funds our addiction to swords, because yeah, we like having swords. We've got a lot of swords. We like new swords because, you have to have swords.
So exciting.
It's so exciting to get a new sword.
When the postman knocks on the door, right, and you open the door and he looks at you and he's got a long sword in the package. He's like, "Is that a like a pogo stick?" And you're like, yeah, cool. And you take it off him, right, and you unwrap it, and you're like, oh, it's a new sword. There's nothing better than a new sword day. It's like Christmas.
Yeah, and they can be expensive. So yeah, it fuels our addiction to swords. It funds it.
But I mean, I'm not sure how this question is going to go down. How many swords can you possibly own? I know there's a handful of varieties, but like, what's the difference between one sword and another?
So there's a handful of varieties, but within those varieties there are going to be differences. So there's differences in that they'll weigh different. There'll be a difference in weight. There'll be a difference in length. There'll be a difference in how much flex they are, how much mass they have, how strong they are in the bind, which is really something that you don't quite understand until you start using them. It's about how much pressure and force that you can feel in the bind when the swords cross. Believe me, that it's a thing, and different swords behave differently, and that's something that your style of fencing will depend on the sword that you're using, whether or not you might be stronger in the bind or weaker in the bind, whether or not you'll thrust more or block more or strike more. That all depends on the specific sword that you're using. And even if we're doing the same style of fencing, so say for example we're doing fencing with a long sword, I will fight differently depending on the sword that I'm using. So having a variety of swords helps you to use a variety of styles. And then we also train with different types of swords as well. So there'll be long swords, rapiers, side swords, arming swords, sabers, messes, daggers. Yeah, all of these different types of weapons that we'll use, and the same kind of variety applies to all of them. So we do not have enough, and I don't think we ever will, Oh, also, sometimes they break.
Yeah,
Fair.
that's tragic.
Yeah.
That's tragic. When you get an idiot run onto the point of your sword and like bends the sword, and you're like, why did you do that? Right?
Jordan, the moment Melissa said, sometimes they break, I could see the heartbreak in your face.
Yeah.
Your face just dropped. Okay, so asking how many swords you could possibly have, clearly that has been well answered.
Yeah.
So it sounds like then, taking out the running costs of what you're doing as a business, you're spending the majority of your profit on buying more swords.
I want armor.
Yeah.
I want a suit of armor. We live in a cottage, so Melissa's a little bit worried about space because already, like, I have to find inventive places of where to put the swords because we put them all over the walls, right? Some are just in a stack at this point, right, against the wall in my office, right? But yeah, like, I want a suit of armor, and this has been an argument that we've been having for about 2 years now. I'm just like, we got an attic. Right, we got an attic. That's fine, right? But apparently, I'm like, yeah, but you can. But here's the thing, right? When you run a fencing school, you can literally write them off on your taxes. So it'd be irresponsible for us. It would be wasteful for us not to buy a suit of armor at this point. Is my argument.
There's you and there's museums, right? They can write off a suit of armor as an expense.
Right.
So, I mean, okay, so you're spending most of the money, by the sounds of it, on buying swords, potentially armor. You could save a fortune, Jordan, if you won some more swords instead of paying for them.
Oh, mate, I thought this was a safe space.
But what does that mean in terms of the future of the academy? Is this something you want to do potentially full-time as a business? Do you ever want to are you planning to leave your jobs to be able to do this full-time? Do you factor that in? Or is it the moment you're enjoying what you're doing, you're loving the fact you're doing this in evening and weekends, you go to tournaments, you've got your community, which is clearly very important to you, and you're happy to spend the profits that you're earning on swords, which I'm guessing allows you to also train those swords with your students as well, right? It's not just for you to keep yourself. Those are parts of what you do in the academy. What is the long-term plan then? How does that factor into your decisions?
So the plan is that it will eventually become Jordan's full-time job. We're kind of using the profits at the moment to fund the purchase of swords so that we have a collection. And eventually we will slow down on that because then we will have the basics of what we need and it's just purchasing replacements. And that, or at least that's what I think, because there'll still be a steady stream. But the goal is that eventually there will be enough coming in for Jordan to be able to do it full time. I'll probably still be working a day job anyway, just because it's good to have a reliable source of income that you don't have to think about taxes on. You just know it's going to come into your bank account regardless, that it's just there. So yeah, I feel like that's a stressless income. Oddly, my day job, but but eventually Jordan will probably be come on to it full time, but we're not quite there yet, but we will be soon. We just need to figure out some ways that we can earn a bit more money doing other things. So one of the things that we do but we haven't done enough of yet is do bachelor parties or bachelor parties, birthday parties, or even just team building corporate events. So you want to have a team building event, check us out. So we do like a couple of hour session where we'll teach you how to use a sword, teach you a few techniques, and then it's basically learn something new and do something new. Yeah, so if anyone's interested and you want to try it out, or if you want to have a gift for someone as an experience, get in contact with us because we do private sessions as well. So, yep, either group or individual, we'll do those.
This perfectly brings me on to my final question. How can people find out more about what you're doing, get in contact? I'll put all the links in the show notes, but where can people find you online?
So to find out about what we do, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube are probably the best places to go. Instagram has the most because that's the one we put the most on. But also we've got a website and you can contact us through the website. So get in touch with us by email or through Messenger, through any of those sources, and we'll be able to answer stuff for you. We run regular beginner classes for those who are interested in attending our Cardiff classes. But if you want to attend our class in Caerphilly or in Marshfield, just get in touch and we'll let you know when to come along to join those classes.
Again, one bonus question for you, Jordan, that I didn't ask earlier. What have you got against milk cartons?
I just, milk cartons killed my father, and I'm trying to find the one milk carton that killed my father like one carton at a time. You know what I mean? No, they're just great for test cutting. They're like, you know, you get a lot of like you cut through it and you're like, oh, okay, yeah, cool, that was good.
Just for a bit of context, we have some sharp swords that Jordan uses to cut bottles with, because to understand the body mechanics of how to do a cut properly and what makes a good cut, it's good to be able to actually practice cutting. So we do have some sharp swords, which is another variety of sword.
Yes.
And the reason, another type of sword. So we have a few sharp swords that we, specifically Jordan more than me because I don't have time, practice cutting, and we cut milk bottles.
Also, if you don't want to come to class, if you're like, you know what, and not for me, right? But you do want to learn historical European martial arts. I do have a book coming out next year. Yeah, so that's coming out early 2024, hopefully. If not late 2024, you know, ready for Christmas. Right? Ready for Christmas. That's but yeah, and that'll be like kind of like from basics to more advanced stuff. So, you know, you got that as well. And that's another side hustle. Yeah. Huzzah.
Maybe we'll bring you back on for a reflection episode when that book comes out.
Yeah.
Jordan and Melissa, thank you so much for joining me today. It was wonderful to hear all about the Academy of Steel. We'll put the links to everything in the show notes. So if anybody wants to find out more, they can find you, watch your videos on Instagram, see exactly what we're talking about today, and see all the different swords that you've got and that you've won, Melissa.
Yeah, whatever, man.
And I look forward to speaking to you again, hopefully in the future.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks, man. It's been great.
Thank you both. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to hear more episodes of Side Ventures, make sure to subscribe wherever you're listening to this podcast. Links and information from this discussion are in the show notes, and if you think you know someone who might like the show, please enjoy sharing this episode with them. If you have any feedback, or you have a side venture you'd like to discuss on the show with me, please send an email to gino@sideventures.co.uk. Finally, if you'd like to support the show, please rate and review Side Ventures on Apple Podcasts, as it helps other people to find us. Thank you.